Thank you for joining us again and welcome back to our channel. Here we talk about Africa's geopolitics, how the continent of Africa engages its geopolitical partners across the European Union, in the United States of America, including Russia, China, India, Middle Eastern partners, and other emerging economies, including Turkey. It is important. Today, I really want to look at the reason why Niger was a most painful experience that France had in terms of its strategic engagement and foreign policy in Africa. Why am I saying this? Because Niger exposed France's weakness in a number of areas in terms of strategic engagement. I was very concerned when I heard the news that at the time, like every other analyst who came on air as the Nigerian government, the military government at the time, which still at the moment still running the nation, came out clear and asked France's ambassador to leave the country. And France's response stunned me. And then I knew that France's global image had been tarnished in terms of that particular relationship. And more importantly, what France's president said shocked me. I will look into this episode to talk about the Vienna Accord and why this particular relationship exposes France's weakness in terms of its strategic engagement in the continent of Africa. But first, let's listen to what the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, said when the military government in the country of Niger asked French ambassador to leave the country. But let's roll that video first and we will dive into specifics.
France's ambassador to Niger is to stay in the country despite an ultimatum from the new army leaders there that he leave. The decision was confirmed today during a major foreign policy speech by the president Emmanuel Macron. During those remarks, Macron confirmed that envoy Sylvain Ité was listening from Niamey, the capital of Niger, hours after the junta's deadline for his departure had expired.
I believe our policy is the correct one. It's based on the courage of President Bazoum, on the efforts of our diplomats and our ambassador in Niger, who will stay despite pressure from coup leaders. We do not recognize them. We support the president, who's not resigned.
To an extent, there is an area of arrogance here. We all looked at in geopolitical circles and global politics how countries request or withdraw the ambassador. The United Kingdom have done that with Russia over and over. Russia has done the same. The United States has done the same. And other countries around the world have asked the ambassador to leave when business or diplomatic relations sour. But with the continent of Africa, it's something else. I think that arrogance, that ignorance in terms of not respecting the institution, irrespective of what institution is in the country, the government in place ask or revoke the status of the ambassador to leave. And then the president of that country says, we're not going to leave, irrespective of what happens, that we do not recognize the current government. I think that is the biggest blunder in geopolitical engagement that I have ever seen.
I believe our policy is the correct one. It's based on the courage of President Bazoum, on the efforts of our diplomats and our ambassador in Niger, who will stay despite pressure from coup leaders. We do not recognize them. We support the president, who's not resigned.
Because it goes a long way to tell these nations in the continent of Africa, especially in the Sahel, that France exposed its patronizing and condescending approach there with regards to that particular statement alone. It sends shockwave across the geopolitical circles around the world. How come can you say that to a nation that in that particular situation, the tense environment, making such condescending comments and throwing fuel into already existing fire? So France expose its weakness in that particular situation, and that sent a message across the continent of Africa, especially in the Sahel, that we told you that they will never respect us, and when we give them orders, they won't follow. And more importantly, how on earth will a Nigerian ambassador stay in France if France asked the ambassador of Niger to leave, and the government in Niger will say to the ambassador that stay in.
All right, let's get some analysis around this now, and we speak to Joseph Ochieno, who is a writer and commentator on African affairs. Mr. Ochieno, thank you very much for your time. Your analysis of the situation that is developing in Niger, how worse are things going to get between this relationship between the new leaders in Niger and France?
That's a very important question, but I think it's not about the situation, or if you like, the relationship between the new regime and France. But I think actually the position France has taken, notwithstanding everything else about coups and unacceptability of coups on the African continent, is a hypocrisy. If African nations talk sovereignty, and if African continent, only recently African leaders were saying that they cannot be instructed, if you like, they cannot be instructed or imposed upon by other global powers, in this particular case, particularly Western leaders. What is it the case? What is it then that a French president decides that his ambassador is not going to leave a sovereign country called Niger? I think the more this mix takes place, the more it becomes very apparent that there is something completely inherently wrong with African systems and institutions, and there is something absolutely wrong about global polity and hypocrisy and contradictions around, if you like, international law and rules. France can go into Niger, Nigeria, or perhaps even powerful South Africa cannot go and play this game on any tiny little African country, even if it was Lesotho, and the rest of the world would keep quiet. So no, while it's absolutely true that coups are not desirable, I have campaigned against the military dictatorship, including my own native one in Uganda, for the last 30 or so years.
Look, sometimes I wonder who advises some of these geopolitical experts. In that case, that speech by the president of France was the biggest blunder, the biggest mistake that I've ever come across in geopolitics. It's important to understand how to, irrespective of the condition on the ground, irrespective of the situation, it's important to acknowledge that the situation is tense, but by you sending a message. Now, talking about the Vienna Accord on diplomatic relations, I think France violated the sovereignty of Niger, irrespective of the government that was in the country. According to that particular accord, the receiving nation has a right to recall or to make that decision that XYZ is no longer needed in this country. Let me read to you what actually the Vienna Accord talk about in that particular situation. If you go to Article 9, Article 9 clearly reads that the receiving state may at any time and without having to explain its decision, notify the sending state that the head of the mission or any member of the diplomatic staff of the mission is persona non grata, or that any other member of staff of the mission is not acceptable. In any such case, the sending state shall, as appropriate, either recall the person concerned or terminate his functions with the mission. A person may be declared non grata or not acceptable before arriving in the territory of the receiving state. In this case, civil aid was already in the country, and the military government said, you are not accepted, you won't be here. This is what convention talk about in terms of diplomatic engagement. So this is pretty clear, and France ignored that. It wanted to do it its way because it knows how to do it its own way, but times have changed. However, if you look at that same Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, on Article 22, it also reads that, just to be very sure, because Niger also had its own error in that particular part, which is important. This was all over the news at the time, because let's go to Article 22 of that particular document. The presence of the mission shall be inviolable. The agents of the receiving state may not enter them except with the consent of the head of the mission. The receiving state is under a special duty to take all appropriate steps to protect the premises of the mission against any intrusion or damage, and to prevent any disturbance of the peace of the mission or impediment of its dignity. The premises of the mission, their furnishings and properties thereafter or thereon, and the means of transport of the mission shall be immune from search, requisition, attachment, or execution. These are very important documents that have been accepted globally in the geopolitical environment and in diplomatic circles. By France not respecting the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, it's a total disgrace for France. And France violated Niger's sovereignty, wanted to make decision on Niger, and wanted to decide on the country of Niger. I think that sparked a lot of anxiety and caused a lot of confusion that went ahead to see them sacking other bitter arrangement during that period. So it's important to note that that behavior by France was the behavior of a colonial power. That's how colonialists behave in that case, because you don't have respect for the institutions.
I believe our policy is the correct one. It's based on the courage of President Bazoum, on the efforts of our diplomats and our ambassador in Niger, who will stay despite pressure from coup leaders. We do not recognise them. We support the president, who's not resigned.
You want to choose who will be the president of the country, irrespective of the condition. There's been a coup and something is going on in the country, but you decided that no, we do not recognize A, we will recognize B. Because why are you recognizing B? Do you make decisions there? It's the mindset, it's that level of entitlement, it's that authoritarian approach that have been in the colonial days, that you can just send that message that I refuse, I don't want this, this is what we want, you have to follow it or you're not. I think such a message was just meant to basically please the local population in France, not who have no idea, who have no better understanding in terms of the strategic engagement, what's going on, the political tension, and the condition on the ground. So that message fell in deaf ears, and it exposes France to an extent. When Macron blinked and the president asked the ambassador to return home, Sylvain Ete. So this was disgraceful for France in terms of its engagement. I think considering France's investment in the continent of Africa, looking at Niger in particular, well, France could not imagine, it could never have imagined that it was time for them to leave Niger, considering the uranium issues and how Niger has also worked with France in a number of areas in terms of France's political engagement and in several areas. Like I said, an American geopolitical analyst once said, if what happened in these West African nations had happened just 20 years ago, France would have crushed whatever uprising or any political uprising or coup or whatever happened in those countries. In the case of Niger, it would have never happened. It would have never happened. So this behavior that Emmanuel Macron demonstrated and that particular speech showed the weakness of France's African policy. It exposes a lot of geopolitical engagement. I also read that a number of France's diplomats across the continent of Africa were furious about such a speech. And also, they were very concerned that Emmanuel Macron, the Elysee, is making decisions for diplomats, those experienced diplomats who've been in the continent, who understand how policies are made in the region. They touch hands and do one or two things to move the ball rolling in the geopolitical environment. But by coming out strong to make such a statement publicly, it's a slap on the face of other France's diplomats who are in the region, who understand this high stake of events in the country. This kind of political engagement on how Africa's geopolitical partners want to work with the continent should understand that these countries sometimes are not foolish. They too understand these global documentations, the global engagement, the principle of engagement is important. So going back, that speech that France president made showed the total weakness of France. It showed the flaws with regards to France's foreign policy in the continent of Africa. It showed disrespect of Nigerian institutions, irrespective of who was there at the time. The same behavior, you would not expect Niger to do that. And no country should say, our ambassador will not leave. You're not going to leave. We don't respect this government. We respect the other government. I think that's a weakness with the status of a country like France. So Niger was a painful experience for France, and it exposed a lot of things. So that's the reason why engaging African governments and countries should be taken with a caution to understand how these governments operate, how these countries operate. Because by approaching them to a condescending manner and talking down to them, exposing certain issues, then you are calling for resistance. They will resist you. They don't give any damn about what's going to happen globally because they also have their own interests to protect. This is something that I think France's behavior during that period, Niger's scenario, exposes how France failed its African engagement in particular. That particular sentiment, that particular speech exposed France's weakness in the continent of Africa. I want to thank you for watching. Hopefully the country of France have learned lessons in the country of Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, including Guinea and other countries in West Africa. To be honest, the historical engagement with France with these countries in West Africa has been that of a disaster, has been that of patronizing, and I hope with other geopolitical partners that are engaging African countries at the moment, no one is free. If you think that you will bring the authoritarian approach to those governments, then that's what you get. Leave us a comment. Let us know what you think in regards to France's behavior at the time, and we'll be looking forward to hearing from you again in our next episode. Have a good day. Bye-bye.